Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series in which I pick on historic vessels, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious, and try to situate them in their historical context, while also looking at the way that they've been represented in a particular game system. And I do this to just generally explore how a game system has treated them, but also to try and pass a bit of judgment, IMHO, on whether these vessels have been treated fairly or not. And today I'm going to look at two very well-known antagonists. We have, of course, HMS Iron Duke from the Royal Navy and Friedrich der Grosse from the Imperial German Navy. And I'm going to be looking at them as they're represented in the Avalanche Press Great War at Sea system. Now, I have done videos a few months ago now covering the system and its gameplay, but just in case you haven't watched those, a quick reminder of what you're shown on a ship counter. Most of this is self-explanatory. You've got the outline of the vessel, national flag, the games assign them an identifying number. That is the speed rating. These numbers relate to the armament, primary guns, secondary guns, tertiary guns. Hull-mounted torpedoes in the circle, and obviously the ship's name. So, why these two particular ships, you might ask? Well, those of you who are familiar with them can probably guess the answer. These two were the fleet flagships of their respective units. For Iron Duke, the British Grand Fleet, and for Friedrich der Grosse, the German High Seas Fleet. And they were flagships from the start of the war until they were both relieved of this duty in 1917 and the commanding admirals transferred their flags to other vessels. So that makes them ideal antagonists in my mind. The other thing is, at the start of the First World War, or more accurately, at the moment when Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, these two ships represented the most modern dreadnoughts available to their respective fleets. I mean, there were others either nearing completion or coming online, but really, in terms of worked up vessels that were ready to go, the Iron Duke class and the Kaiser class were the ones that led their respective fleets in terms of being at the edge of the technological achievement. So that's another reason for it. Both participated in just about every major operation their fleets were involved in throughout the First World War. And most significantly, both of these ships were present at Jutland, where they didn't actually lob shells at each other. They were in the wrong part of the battle area for that, but they did participate in the same battle, and they may or may not even have been within sight of each other at some point. So just a tiny bit of background, really, to these vessels. So the older one by a short margin is the Friedrich der Grosse. And she represents an important milestone in German naval architecture in this period because she is the missing, well, I won't say the missing link, but she is the bridge between the older pattern of German dreadnought ships like Westfalen, where they had a turret arrangement that was almost like the earlier French lozenge design. You would have wing turrets with superstructure in between them. So if you imagine turrets all along the sides. And this is fine, but the problem is they can only train out on the side they're placed on. So it's a powerful gun battery, but it's wasteful. The British had found this as well and had moved away from this design. And so Friedrich der Grosse and her sisters were pretty handsome ships. I've got a picture of Friedrich der Grosse herself here in somewhat happier times. And there she is looking absolutely splendid at one of the fleet reviews. And it's possible to pick out some of the features that distinguish the Kaiser class. Now, one of them was the very, very widely spaced funnels that you can see here. It's a very easy distinguishing feature close to the fore and main masts. And the reason for this wide placement was because of the echelon turrets over here. So you had the starboard turret, which was echeloned forward, and the port turret would be echeloned slightly aft. I've got a later photograph of her. Sadly, this one taken when she was steaming towards the Firth of Forth to be placed in the custody of the victorious Entente powers. But because this is an aerial view taken from a British airship, you can see the arrangement of the turret. So this was the Germans well on their way to adopting the idea of an all centerline turret ship, but they had not quite made that mental and naval architectural leap. But nonetheless, these ships are very important because they were a great step in that direction. And in most respects, they were very, very well designed warships. Now, looking at Iron Duke, which is a very different ship, you can see that the British have, oh Lord, she's quite large. I'm just going to have to back up a tiny bit, everyone. There we go. So this is HMS Iron Duke as new. She still has her taller mast with the pre-war wireless telegraphy arrangement. And you can see just about that she is an all centerline turret ship. So she's got the same number of primary gun turrets as her German opposite number. But she doesn't have any of the older British pattern where you've got echelons or the old dreadnought style where you'd have a wing turret on each side. She maximizes her gun power because the idea of the wing turret harkened back to the days when powerful end-on fire was considered important. Or as some admirals still fondly imagined, your battleships would find themselves in a melee situation where you'd be engaging targets on both sides. Now, maybe that could have happened on and off, but as naval tactics developed in the first and second decades of the 20th century, it was becoming more and more obvious that the best form of control was line of battle. And this invariably meant that you'd be engaging an enemy on one side or another, very seldom on both. So there was no real need for these big turrets that could only train on one side, and otherwise you'd have a lot of wasted space. So there is Iron Duke as brand spanking new. She's very much the apogee of British battleship design at this point, as I say. She was a development of two preceding classes. So around the time the Germans were thinking of what became the Kaiser class, the British had brought the Orion class into service, and the Orions were the ones that introduced the all centerline turrets into British service. The succeeding King George V class were a close development following on from those, and then came the four ships of the Iron Duke class. Now, the most significant change, in fact, there were two that the Iron Dukes brought in. The first was the secondary battery. For a very long time, largely thanks to Admiral Sir John Fisher's influence, the British had resisted putting a heavy secondary battery into their dreadnoughts. Fisher's theory of big guns sort of assumed that these wouldn't really be necessary. And as they were almost grudgingly introduced in the classes that followed the original HMS Dreadnought, originally it was just 12-pounder guns. That equates to about 3-inch. And then slowly the Navy accepted 4-inch. But by the time the Iron Dukes were being designed, the Navy had decided, the seagoing fleet wanted a heavier gun. Destroyers had got faster, they'd got bigger, they'd got tougher. If you wanted to knock out an incoming enemy destroyer with torpedo attacks in mind, you wanted a gun that had enough oomph to damage it while having enough agility to be able to follow it as a target. And so after a fair bit of wrangling, the Iron Dukes brought in the 6-inch gun battery. Now, Iron Duke herself was a test bed. You can't really see them on this photo, so I'll bring in another one. Here we go, if it'll come over here. You can just make out these casemates near the stern. Now, those were for the last two guns of the 6-inch battery. These proved very wet in anything but the calmest conditions, and so in Iron Duke they were very rapidly suppressed and the guns were moved over to the main battery. The other important development, and you see its beginnings here, was the arrangements for centralized fire control. This is quite important because the British were groping their way towards this when the war began. On paper, it was a more efficient system than the one the Imperial German Navy used, but the Royal Navy suffered problems because they were caught halfway through developing it by the outbreak of the war. And so while the German system was, broadly speaking, more simplistic, it was more simplistic in a good way. And the Germans also benefited from a greater uniformity of good equipment, which, for example, their rangefinders were the stereoscopic system they used could return accurate ranges faster than the Royal Navy's rangefinders could. So on paper, better gunnery direction system for the Royal Navy, but the Germans had something that was quicker and in certain circumstances more effective. So that was a nice quick bit of background there. Now, when it comes to these two, how fair have the game designers been to them? Let's have a look at the speed first. So speed rating of 1 in a square box, that makes them pretty fast in game terms. And actually, I don't think that is too unfair a comparison for these two ships, because historically, HMS Iron Duke achieved 21 and a smidge knots on trials. That was the best speed she ever attained. And in pretty much all conditions, she could get up to 20. She was a very good steamer. And the same really with the Friedrich der Grosse. She was not quite as fast as the Iron Duke on trials, but she too could manage about 20 knots in pretty much any condition. So I think we've got a pretty fair rating with those two ships there. What about the firepower? Let's look at the primary gun batteries, because Iron Duke had 10 13.5-inch guns versus Friedrich der Grosse's 10 12-inch guns. So, I mean, she's been rated a 7 and Iron Duke has been rated a 9. Now, I'm not sure what to make of this because both types of gun were very, very good. They were reliable, they had a good rate of fire, they were accurate. In terms of the bore of the shell, there's only an 1.5 inch difference between the two, of course, and the British shell, to be fair, was significantly heavier than its German counterpart. But I don't know whether that's a big enough difference to justify a 2-point difference. I mean, 7 and 9 is a bit of a gap. I'm not too sure what calculus was used to work that one out, but I would suggest maybe the Germans need to be bumped up one, or maybe the British need to be shaved one down. But that's just my view on it. Maybe the weight of shell does make enough of a difference. Things look better with the secondary batteries of the two ships. Iron Duke had a complement of 12 6-inch guns, and the Friedrich der Grosse had a complement of 14 5.9-inch guns. Now, it's a good number on both sides, and both, aside from the initial design flaw with Iron Dukes, were very well sighted in good battery positions where they had excellent command. And finally, we get the tertiary gun. So so just to say, I agree with the 2 and 2 rating for the secondary armament. Now, here's another one I have a slight problem with. So Iron Duke is quite rightly rated as 0 because the only guns she had smaller than the 6-inch were a couple of 12-pounders, and those were purely for anti-Zeppelin work. They were never meant to engage surface targets. Friedrich der Grosse had a slightly thicker anti-aircraft armament, and she also did have a large number of the excellent German 88mm guns. But unlike her secondaries, her 5.9s, these tiny guns were dispersed around the hull, and they were not really placed in mutually supporting positions. They were more like sprinkled around in penny packets in an effort to try and cover blind spots. So they couldn't achieve a concentration of fire, and they didn't have any good fire direction. These were independent fire weapons. In fact, they were regarded as fairly useless, and they were removed partway through the war. So I think giving Friedrich der Grosse a 1, perhaps simply on the strength of the number of these things, is perhaps a little over generous. I personally would have downgraded that to a 0. I have no quarrel with the torpedo rating. Both ships have a pretty, even number of hull-mounted torpedoes in broadside mounting, so that's fair. So much for the armament. Now that does cover the entirety of these counters, but what about the bits that are not shown? Because this is one of those games that deals with damage and armor in a slightly different way. Now, I've just realized, unfortunately, I have left my armor diagrams somewhere else where they're not really accessible at the moment. So with some reluctance, I'm going to have to close this video at this point. It's all very embarrassing. But I will be recording a part 2 very, very soon, where I talk about the armor protection and the overall flood protection schemes of these ships. And I will come back to deal with the history of these ships as well. And I will record that over the next day or so that it can be a very quick 2-parter for this. So sorry to leave you at this very early point when I was just warming up to my topic, but that'll teach me to be forgetful and leave my armor diagrams in the wrong place. No. So I'll sign off here, but before I go, I just want to give a shout out to another YouTuber who got in touch with me just before I vanished in the summer on the big work project. And the gentleman goes by the YouTube name of Nangwaya. And if you are interested in gaming with a focus on the First World War, he runs an excellent channel. I'll put a link to it down in the description. I really recommend you go over there and see what he has to offer. I've been following him since the early summer, and I think he's brilliant. If you like what you're seeing, please do give him some likes and a subscription, because he's well worth it. Really great content and a really engaging guy. So I'll leave you at that point. As I say, I will return to this as soon as possible when I find my armor diagrams. My usual Jane's Fighting Ships copies, and I will create a part 2 and finish this video off. But in the meantime, it's so good to be back after a very long absence. A huge thank you to all my long-suffering veterans, and those of you who are new to the channel, a warm welcome. If it's wargaming that brought you here, then please do have a look around the channel. I hope you find other videos that you like. If you came here specifically for Avalanche Press's The Great War at Sea system, it's a wonderful game system, not without its drawbacks, but largely wonderful. Do check out the videos I've done on Volume 2, which is The Great War at Sea in Northern Waters. And that is the module that these two fine vessels hail from. So farewell for now, and thank you for tuning in to part 1. And I very much look forward to seeing you all in part 2, where I will draw some conclusions and fill you in on a bit more history about these two incredible warships. Thank you very much, and do take care. Bye.